The morning sun cast razor-sharp shadows across the Arizona territory as Ben Garrett rode out to check his herd. 45 years of desert living had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes, but his hands still rested steady on the Winchester across his saddle horn. 3 years of peaceful ranching hadn't softened the instincts that kept a man alive in Apache country. Ben had been sheriff of Tombstone once, back when that meant something more than collecting taxes and breaking up saloon fights. He'd worn the badge through the bloodiest years of the territory's birth, until the day he decided some victories cost more than defeat. Now he ran 2,000 head of prime beef across land he'd bought with his own sweat and the respect of men who knew what real work looked like. The first sign that his peaceful days were ending hit him like a sledgehammer to the gut. 12 of his prize-breeding bulls lay scattered across Mesa Verde, their throats cut with surgical precision. But this wasn't rustling or Indian raids. Each massive carcass bore the same symbol carved deep into the hide, a crude letter R that made Ben's blood turn to ice water. The Raven Gang, back from hell itself. Ben's horse snorted and sidestepped, sensing the death that hung thick in the desert air. 3 years ago, Ben had put their leader, Blackjack Raven, behind bars after a gunfight that left 4 men dead in Tombstone's dusty streets. The territorial judge had sentenced Blackjack to 10 years hard labor in Yuma prison, a stone hellhole where most men died before serving half their time. Most men. But Blackjack Raven wasn't most men. Ben dismounted and knelt beside the nearest carcass, studying the wound patterns with the eye of a man who'd seen too much violence. Professional work, methodical and cruel. This wasn't about cattle or money. This was about sending a message that would carry across the territory like wildfire. The thunder of approaching hooves made Ben wheel around, his rifle coming up smooth and fast. Relief flooded through him when he recognized the familiar figure of Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley, riding hard across the flats with dust plume trailing behind him. "Ben!" Tom's voice cracked with urgency as he reined up hard. "We need to talk. Now!" Tom Bradley had been Ben's right hand during the worst of the Tombstone troubles, a solid man who'd never backed down from a fight or a hard decision. Now he wore a federal badge and carried the weight of law enforcement across 3 counties of the meanest country God ever made. "Let me guess," Ben said grimly, gesturing toward the butchered cattle. "Blackjack Raven walked out of Yuma prison." Tom's weathered face told the whole story. 2 weeks ago, guards said he was a model prisoner, reformed by scripture and hard work. He spat tobacco juice into the sand. Only thing Blackjack reformed was his patience for revenge. Ben studied the methodical carnage spread across his grazing land. He didn't do this alone. Takes more than 1 man to kill 12 bulls this clean without spooking the herd. "That's the other news," Tom said, dismounting to examine the carvings. "Intelligence from Tucson says he's got himself a new crew. 15 men, maybe more. All Confederate veterans who fought under his command during the war." The pieces clicked together in Ben's mind like rounds sliding into a rifle chamber. Quantrill's Raiders. I should have known. During the Civil War, Blackjack had ridden with William Quantrill's irregular cavalry, a band of Confederate guerrillas who specialized in hit-and-run tactics that blurred the line between warfare and terrorism. They'd burned Lawrence, Kansas, and massacred Union prisoners at Centralia. Men who'd survived that kind of organized brutality didn't just fade away into civilian life. "He wants the gold," Ben said quietly. Tom nodded grimly. 50,000 in double eagles from 6 different banks. By law, you should have turned it over to the territorial government when you captured the gang. Instead, Ben had made a choice that seemed right at the time, but felt heavier with each passing year. He'd used every cent of that blood money to build a school and medical clinic for Tombstone, facilities that had saved dozens of lives and given hope to a community built on violence and greed. "You think he knows what you really did with it?" Tom asked. Before Ben could answer, A new voice cut through their conversation, heavily accented but clear as mountain water. "Senor Ben, you need to see this." Miguel Santos emerged from behind a boulder outcrop, his weathered hands holding a piece of paper like it might bite him. Ben's foreman had been with him since the beginning, a vaquero whose loyalty ran deeper than blood and whose knowledge of this harsh land could mean the difference between life and death. Ben took the paper and read the message scrawled in charcoal. "3 days, Garrett. Bring the gold to Blood Canyon at sunset, or we start killing everyone you care about. Time to finish what we started. J.R." Tom whistled low through his teeth. Blood Canyon. Son of a bitch wants to settle this where it began. Blood Canyon was where Ben had cornered the Raven Gang 3 years ago. A natural amphitheater of red sandstone carved by flash floods, with high walls that echoed gunshots like thunder and narrow passages that could hide an army. It was also where Ben had killed 2 of Blackjack's men in the firefight that ended with the outlaw leader in chains. Miguel shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Patron, there is something else. Eddie Walsh did not return to the bunkhouse last night. His horse is gone. And Carlos found tracks leading north toward the old mining camp." Eddie Walsh, young, quiet, maybe 30 years old. He'd been working the ranch for 8 months, keeping to himself and doing his job without complaint. Now his absence felt like another piece of a puzzle clicking into place with an audible snap. "Could be coincidence," Tom offered, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than Ben did. "Could be," Ben agreed. "Or could be we've been harboring a snake in our nest without knowing it." A distant rifle shot cracked across the desert, the sound sharp and purposeful. All 3 men tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But the shot hadn't been aimed at them. It was a signal, meant to draw their attention to the ridgeline where a lone figure sat his horse in plain view. Ben pulled a brass spyglass from his saddlebags and focused on the distant rider. Even at half a mile, Blackjack Raven's silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, lean, sitting his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never met his equal in a fair fight. As Ben watched, Blackjack raised his own rifle and fired twice more into the air, a cavalry signal that any former soldier would recognize. Assembly and advance. Somewhere out there, 14 other men were moving into position for whatever came next. "He's not planning to wait 3 days, Ben said, collapsing the spyglass with a decisive snap. "What do you mean?" Tom asked. "Look at the timing. He kills my cattle at dawn, knowing I'll find them within hours. Leaves a message demanding a meeting in 3 days, but positions himself where we can see him immediately." Ben's strategic mind was working through the tactical implications. He's testing our response, seeing how we react to pressure. Miguel checked the action on his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had seen action against Apaches and rustlers. "What do we do, Patron?" Before Ben could answer, a new sound reached them from the direction of the ranch house. The clear, measured tolling of the dinner bell in a pattern that meant trouble. Someone was at the ranch, and Miguel's wife Maria was sounding the alarm. "Riders coming in fast." Tom pointed toward the main buildings, where a dust cloud was rising from the direction of the road. Ben's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. If Blackjack wanted to parley, he'd come himself. If he wanted to attack, he wouldn't announce it with bell signals. They mounted up and rode hard toward the ranch house, weapons ready and nerves strung tight as piano wire. As they crested the last rise, Ben could see a small group of riders in the yard, maybe 6 men, sitting their horses with military precision, while Maria kept her distance on the porch with a shotgun across her knees. The leader of the group was a man Ben didn't recognize. Tall, distinguished, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested wealth and position. But it was the way he sat his horse that caught Ben's attention. Ramrod straight, left hand holding the reins, while his right stayed free for weapon work. Professional posture that spoke of years in the saddle and probably more years in uniform. "You Ben Garrett," the stranger called out as they approached. Depends who's asking, Ben replied, reining up just outside easy pistol range. The man smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his pale blue eyes. Colonel James Morrison, late of the Confederate States Army. I believe you and I have a mutual acquaintance. Do we now? Blackjack Raven. Morrison's voice carried the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. I understand he's been in touch regarding certain financial matters. Ben felt Tom tense beside him. This was getting complicated fast, and complications in Apache country usually meant someone ended up dead. What's Blackjack to you, Colonel? Ben asked. He's a deserter, a thief, and a murderer who's been using my name and reputation to recruit men for his private war. Morrison's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. During the late unpleasantness, Sergeant Raven served under my command with distinction. When the war ended, I expected him to return to civilian life like the rest of us. Instead, he used his contacts among former Confederate soldiers to build a criminal empire. And you want to stop him? I want to kill him. Morrison's blunt honesty was like a slap in the face. The man has dishonored everything I spent 4 years fighting for. His actions reflect on every officer who served under General Lee, and I won't have my reputation destroyed by the criminal activities of a rogue sergeant. Ben studied Morrison's face, looking for deception and finding only the cold fury of a professional soldier who'd been betrayed by one of his own men. What makes you think I'll help you? Because Blackjack Raven is coming for you, whether you want him to or not. Because you don't have enough men to fight a guerrilla campaign against experienced cavalry soldiers, and because I can give you information that might keep you alive long enough to see this through. The proposition hung in the desert air like smoke from a campfire. Ben could feel the weight of decision pressing down on him. Trust a stranger with his life and the lives of his men, or face Blackjack's revenge alone with whatever help Tom could scrape together from surrounding counties. What kind of information? Tom asked. Morrison smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. The kind that tells you Blackjack isn't planning to wait 3 days for your answer. The kind that tells you he's already positioned men around your ranch and plans to hit you tonight when the moon sets. The kind that might save your life, Mr. Garrett. Ben's blood went cold. How do you know that? Because I've been tracking him for 6 months, studying his methods, learning his patterns. Blackjack Raven may be a criminal, but he's still thinking like a cavalry officer, and I trained him well enough to predict his next move. The dinner bell tolled again from the ranch house. 3 long, slow rings. That was Maria's signal for immediate danger. Ben wheeled his horse toward the sound and saw what had spooked her. On the northern ridge where Blackjack had been watching, signal fires were blooming like deadly flowers. 3 columns of smoke rising straight up in the still air, clearly visible for miles in any direction. Assembly points, Morrison said quietly. He's calling in his scattered forces for a coordinated attack. Gentlemen, if we're going to work together, we need to do it now. In about 4 hours, this ranch is going to become a battlefield. Ben looked at Tom, then at Miguel, seeing the same grim understanding in their faces. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. All right, Colonel, Ben said finally. Let's talk. The ranch house's main room had been transformed into a war council, with maps spread across the heavy oak table and rifles leaning against every wall. Coal oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the stone walls as 8 men planned for a battle that would determine whether Ben Garrett lived to see another sunrise. Colonel Morrison had brought 4 men with him, all former Confederate cavalry, all seasoned fighters who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of professionals. Combined with Tom's deputies and Miguel's vaqueros, they had 16 men to face Blackjack's 15-man gang. Even odds if you didn't count experience, terrain, and the fact that Blackjack had chosen the time and place for this confrontation. Tell me about your defenses, Morrison said, studying Ben's hand-drawn map of the ranch layout. Ben pointed to key positions. Main house is stone and timber construction, built to withstand Apache raids. Good fields of fire in all directions, but only two ways in or out. Barn's got a hayloft that'll stop rifle fire, and the bunkhouse has been reinforced with adobe bricks. Water supply? Well, in the courtyard, but it's exposed. If they pin us down, we won't be able to get to it without taking casualties. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Blackjack will know all this. He's had months to plan this attack, probably sent men to scout your positions while you thought you were safe. Tom leaned forward, his weathered face grim in the lamplight. What would you do in his place? Hit you from 3 directions simultaneously, Morrison replied without hesitation. Pin your main force in the house with rifle fire from the ridge, then send assault teams against the barn and bunkhouse. Once he controls those positions, he can burn you out or just wait for your ammunition to run low. Miguel spoke up from his position near the window, where he'd been keeping watch on the approaching darkness. Senor Colonel, my men know this land better than any soldiers. We can use the arroyos to move without being seen. Good, Morrison said. We'll need that advantage. Ben, how much ammunition do you have? Ben had been dreading that question. Maybe 300 rounds total, mixed rifle and pistol, enough for a short fight, not enough for a siege. Then we make it a short fight. Morrison's pale eyes glinted with tactical possibility. We let Blackjack start his attack, make him commit his forces, then hit him from an unexpected direction while he's focused on the buildings. Before anyone could respond, the ranch door burst open and Eddie Walsh stumbled in, his face pale and his clothes torn. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, and his hands shook as he tried to speak. Mr. Garrett, he gasped, I got something to tell you, and it ain't good. Ben felt every eye in the room focus on the young cowhand. Start talking, Eddie. I've been working for Blackjack, Eddie blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them said. He approached me 3 months ago, offered me $100 to report on your routines, your defenses, how many men you had. The silence that followed was so complete, Ben could hear the coal oil flames hissing in their glass chimneys. Tom's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Ben held up a restraining gesture. Keep talking, Ben said quietly. I needed the money, Eddie continued, his voice breaking. My ma's sick back in Kansas, needs medicine I can't afford on cowhand wages. Blackjack said all he wanted was information, that nobody would get hurt. But, Morrison prompted, but tonight I found out what he really plans to do. Eddie's eyes were wide with genuine horror. He's not just coming for the gold, Mr. Garrett. He's going to kill everyone on this ranch, burn the buildings, and make it look like an Apache raid. Then he's going to hit the town of Tombstone the same way, settling scores with everyone who helped put him in prison. The implications of Eddie's revelation hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't just about revenge or stolen money anymore. Blackjack was planning a massacre that would terrorize the entire territory. How many men does he have? Morrison asked, his voice sharp with military authority. 15, like we thought, but they've got more than rifles. They've got dynamite, probably stolen from the mining camps, and they've got Apaches helping them. Ben's blood went cold. Apaches? A renegade band led by a warrior called Broken Arrow. Maybe 20 braves who've been raiding both sides of the border since Geronimo was captured. Blackjack promised them half the loot from Tombstone in exchange for their help tonight. Tom cursed under his breath. 35 men against our 16, and we're fighting on 2 fronts against enemies who know each other's tactics. Morrison was already adjusting his mental calculations. Changes everything. We can't defend static positions against that many attackers. We need to break up their coordination, force them to fight us piecemeal. How? Ben asked. We abandon the ranch. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Miguel was the first to speak, his voice tight with emotion. Abandon our home? Let them burn everything we have worked for? Better than dying for buildings that can be rebuilt, Morrison replied pragmatically. Blackjack expects you to defend the ranch because that's what any reasonable man would do. But if we're not here when he attacks, we control the initiative. Ben studied the map, his strategic mind working through possibilities. Where do we make our stand? Morrison's finger traced a route northeast of the ranch buildings. Devil's Backbone, that rocky spine about 2 miles from here. Good defensive positions, multiple escape routes, and terrain that favors defenders over attackers. What about the women? Tom asked. Maria and the other ranch families? We evacuate them south toward Tucson, Ben said. Miguel, can you get them moving within the hour? Miguel nodded grimly. Si, Patron. They will not like leaving, but they will go. Eddie Walsh had been listening to the tactical discussion with growing agitation. Mr. Garrett, there's something else. Blackjack knows about Devil's Backbone. He's been studying this area for months, learning every rock and gully. Morrison's eyes sharpened. How do you know that? Because he sent me to scout it 2 weeks ago. Made me draw maps of the approaches, count the defensive positions, measure distances for rifle fire. The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. Blackjack had been planning this campaign like a military operation, gathering intelligence and preparing for every contingency. He knew their land better than they did, and he'd anticipated their most logical defensive strategy. So we give him what he doesn't expect, Ben said slowly. We go to ground he hasn't scouted, use tactics he won't anticipate. Where? Morrison asked. Ben's finger moved to a different section of the map, tracing the serpentine curves of an ancient riverbed. Skeleton Creek. It's been dry for 5 years, but the banks are 15 feet high in places and riddled with caves. Apache have used it for ambushes since before the Spanish came through here. Morrison studied the topographical features Ben was indicating. Difficult terrain, easy to get lost or separated. That works both ways, Miguel pointed out. If we know the creek and they do not, we have the advantage. It's risky, Tom said. If they corner us down there, we'd have nowhere to run. Ben looked around the room at the faces of men who'd chosen to stand with him against impossible odds. Everything we're doing is risky. Question is, do we want to die defending buildings, or do we want to take some of them with us? The vote was unanimous. For the next 2 hours, the ranch buzzed with carefully controlled activity. Weapons were checked and ammunition distributed. The women and children were loaded into wagons and started south under escort by 2 of Morrison's men. Essential supplies were cached at predetermined points along the route to Skeleton Creek. As they prepared to abandon the only home he'd known for 3 years, Ben found himself standing on the porch one last time, memorizing details he might never see again. The hand-split rails he'd installed himself. The flower garden Maria had coaxed from the harsh soil. The barn where he'd spent countless hours caring for horses and cattle that represented years of honest work. Morrison joined him in the darkness. Second thoughts? Just saying goodbye, Ben replied. A man ought to know what he's fighting for. And what are you fighting for, Mr. Garrett? Ben considered the question as he watched the last wagon disappear into the desert night. The right to build something instead of just tearing it down? The chance for good men to live without fear? The idea that civilization means something more than who's got the biggest gun? Morrison nodded slowly. Those are things worth dying for. They're things worth living for, too, Ben said, which is why we're going to win. As they mounted up for the ride to Skeleton Creek, Ben could see the glow of signal fires burning on the northern horizon. Blackjack Raven was calling in his forces for the final assault on an empty ranch. By the time he discovered his mistake, Ben and his men would be dug in at Skeleton Creek, ready to turn the hunter into the hunted. The desert night swallowed 16 riders as they disappeared into the labyrinth of arroyos and mesas that would either save their lives or become their grave. Behind them, the ranch waited in darkness for an attack that would find only empty buildings and cold ashes. The real battle was about to begin. The first shots of the battle echoed across the desert at midnight as Blackjack Raven's assault force hit the empty ranch with overwhelming firepower. From their position 3 miles away in Skeleton Creek, Ben and his men could see the muzzle flashes strobing like lightning against the darkness, followed by the orange glow of burning buildings. "He's using the dynamite," Morrison observed, watching the distant explosions through Ben's spyglass. "Probably figured you'd barricade yourselves in the main house." Ben felt a cold satisfaction at having outguessed his enemy, mixed with genuine grief at watching 3 years of hard work go up in flames. How long before he realizes we're not there? Not long. Blackjack's too experienced to waste time on empty buildings once he understands what's happened. Tom Bradley crouched beside them on the creek bank, his rifle trained on the approach routes they'd scouted earlier. "Question is, will he come after us here or head straight for Tombstone?" "He'll come after us," Eddie Walsh said from his position 20 yards downstream. The young cowhand had insisted on taking the most dangerous spot in their defensive line, trying to atone for months of betrayal with a display of courage that might cost him his life. Blackjack don't leave enemies alive behind him. It's not his way. Morrison checked his pocket watch by starlight. Dawn in 4 hours. If he's going to hit us, it'll be just before sunrise when the light's in our eyes. The tactical situation was both better and worse than Ben had hoped. Skeleton Creek provided excellent concealment and multiple firing positions among the eroded limestone banks. But it was also a trap. If Blackjack managed to seal both ends of the canyon, Ben's men would be caught like rats in a barrel. Miguel Santos had positioned his vaqueros at the southern approach, where their knowledge of desert warfare would be most valuable against Apache allies. Morrison's Confederate veterans held the northern end, using their cavalry experience to watch for mounted assault. Ben and Tom controlled the center, ready to reinforce wherever the attack hit hardest. The waiting was the worst part. Men who could face bullets and death without flinching turned nervous and jumpy when forced to sit motionless for hours, listening to every sound the desert made and wondering if it meant enemy movement. "Contact south!" Miguel's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife blade. Ben turned his spyglass toward the southern approach and felt his heart sink. At least 20 Apache warriors were working their way through the rocks, moving with the fluid grace of men who'd been born to this kind of warfare. Behind them, he could make out the bulkier shapes of mounted white men, Blackjack's Confederate veterans providing backup for the Indian assault. "Here they come!" Tom called out, spotting movement to the north as well. Blackjack had divided his forces, hitting Skeleton Creek from both directions simultaneously, while keeping his main body in reserve for the final assault. It was exactly what Ben would have done in his place, and exactly what they prepared for. "Remember," Ben called out to his men, "let them get close before you open fire. Make every shot count." The Apache came in silence, flowing through the rocks like deadly shadows. Ben had fought them before and knew their tactics. Close quickly to minimize exposure to rifle fire, then overwhelm defensive positions with numbers and ferocity. But this time the defenders were ready. Miguel's first shot cracked across the canyon like thunder, dropping the lead Apache warrior at 50 yards. His vaqueros opened up immediately, their Winchester rifles speaking with deadly precision. But the Apache didn't break. They scattered for cover and began working closer, using every boulder and crevice for concealment. At the north end, Morrison's veterans were engaged in a different kind of fight. Blackjack's mounted assault hit them head-on, relying on shock and firepower to punch through their defensive line. The sound of cavalry carbines echoed off the canyon walls as horses screamed and men shouted orders in the chaos of close combat. Ben! Tom pointed toward the eastern rim of the canyon. Riflemen on the high ground! Blackjack had positioned sharpshooters to fire down into the creek bed, turning their defensive advantage into a killing zone. Bullets began whining off the limestone walls, sending chips of rock flying like shrapnel. Ben made a decision that went against every tactical manual ever written. Instead of staying in cover, he grabbed his rifle and began climbing the canyon wall, using hand and foot holds carved by centuries of flash floods. Where the hell are you going? Tom shouted. To even the odds, Ben called back, pulling himself up the nearly vertical rock face. The climb was nightmare in slow motion. Loose stones giving way under his boots, rifle catches on protruding rocks, bullets striking the wall inches from his head. But Ben had grown up in this country, learned to climb before he could ride, and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. He reached the rim just as one of Blackjack's sharpshooters was drawing a bead on Miguel's position. Ben's first shot took the man in the chest, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering into the darkness. His second shot caught another sniper as he turned to face this new threat. But now Ben was exposed on the canyon rim with nowhere to run and half a dozen enemies converging on his position. He scrambled behind a boulder as bullets chewed chunks from the stone around him. Colonel, Eddie Walsh's voice carried across the canyon, they're flanking us through the side draw. Ben could see the tactical situation falling apart. Blackjack had committed his reserves, using the Apache and cavalry attacks as distractions, while his main force worked through a hidden approach that would put them behind the defensive line. In minutes, Ben's men would be caught in a crossfire with no escape route. That's when the unexpected happened. The sound of a cavalry bugle cut through the chaos of battle, playing the clear notes of charge with professional precision. From the eastern approach came the thunder of galloping horses and the wild war cries of men who'd found their enemy at last. Colonel Morrison had kept his final trump card hidden until this moment. A troop of 20 cavalry veterans who'd been trailing Blackjack Raven for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to settle old scores. Now they hit the battlefield like an avalanche of horseflesh and steel, smashing into Blackjack's rear guard with devastating effect. The tide of battle turned in seconds. Blackjack's carefully coordinated attack dissolved into chaos as his men found themselves fighting on three fronts simultaneously. The Apache, sensing the shift in momentum, began withdrawing through the rocks with the fluid grace that had brought them into the fight. Ben seized the moment, leading a charge down the canyon wall that caught Blackjack's remaining snipers from behind. Tom and his deputies poured fire into the confused mass of enemies below, while Miguel's vaqueros advanced from cover to finish the job. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The canyon floor was littered with the dead and wounded, while the survivors of Blackjack's gang scattered into the desert like leaves before a hurricane. All except one. Blackjack Raven himself stood in the center of the canyon floor, his uniform torn and bloody, but his rifle still in his hands. Around him lay the bodies of men who'd followed him from the battlefields of Kansas to this God-forsaken creek in Arizona territory. Ben Garrett, Blackjack's voice echoed off the canyon walls. This ends between you and me. Ben climbed down from the rim slowly, his rifle ready but not aimed. This was the moment 3 years in the making, the final confrontation that would settle all debts and determine who walked away from Skeleton Creek alive. It's over, Jack, Ben said as he approached. Your men are dead or scattered. Surrender now and I'll see you get a fair trial. Blackjack's laugh was like broken glass. Fair trial? From the man who stole my life's work and gave it away to a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers? That money never belonged to you. It belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it. Blackjack's mask of control finally slipped, revealing the twisted hatred that had consumed him during 3 years in prison. You had no right to play God with money I earned with blood and courage. Colonel Morrison stepped into view, his uniform crisp despite the battle that had just ended. Sergeant Raven, You are under arrest for desertion, murder, and crimes against the Confederate States of America. Blackjack turned toward his former commander, and for a moment his face showed genuine surprise. Colonel Morrison, what are you doing here? Cleaning up a mistake I made 20 years ago when I taught you how to be a soldier. Morrison's voice carried the authority of absolute judgment. You've dishonored everything we fought for, Jack. Everything we believed in. I believed in winning, Blackjack snarled. I believed in taking what we needed to survive in a world that wanted us dead. You believed in your own greed, Morrison replied. And now you'll pay for it. The final confrontation came without warning or ceremony. Blackjack simply raised his rifle and fired at Ben, who threw himself sideways and rolled behind a boulder as the bullet sang past his ear. Ben's return shot was carefully aimed and perfectly timed. The .45-70 round took Blackjack high in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the sand. But the outlaw leader wasn't finished. With his last breath, he pulled a concealed pistol and triggered one final shot at the man who destroyed his dreams. Colonel Morrison stepped between them, taking the bullet meant for Ben. The impact drove him backward, but he stayed on his feet long enough to draw his own sidearm and put 2 rounds into Blackjack's center mass. This time, Blackjack Raven stayed down. Ben knelt beside Morrison as the colonel slumped against a boulder, blood spreading across his white shirt. Why? Ben asked. Morrison's smile was peaceful, almost relieved. Because some debts can only be paid in blood, and because that boy was my responsibility long before he became your enemy. The colonel died as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting Skeleton Creek in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, the desert was already beginning to reclaim the battlefield, with vultures circling overhead and coyotes calling from distant ridges. Eddie Walsh emerged from cover, his face pale but determined. Mr. Garrett, what do we do now? Ben looked around at the aftermath of the battle, dead enemies, wounded friends, and the smoking ruins of his ranch visible on the northern horizon. Everything he'd built over 3 years was gone, destroyed by the ghosts of choices made in what felt like another lifetime. Now we go home, Ben said finally, and we start building again. Tom Bradley joined them, favoring his left arm where an Apache arrow had found its mark. What about the ranch? Stone foundations don't burn, Miguel said, appearing with his vaqueros. We can rebuild everything else. Ben nodded, feeling something settle in his chest that had been restless for 3 years. Then that's what we'll do. But this time, we build it right. Strong enough to last. As they gathered their dead and wounded for the long journey home, Ben couldn't help but think about the gold that had started this whole bloody affair. $50,000 in stolen money that he'd given away to build a school and clinic. At the time, it had seemed like the right choice, maybe the only choice a decent man could make. Now, standing in a canyon littered with the bodies of men who died for that money, Ben knew he'd choose the same way again. Some things were worth more than gold. Some principles were worth defending, no matter what the cost. The sun climbed higher over Arizona territory, burning away the shadows of the night and revealing a landscape that was harsh but honest, violent but clean. It was a land that demanded the best from the men who chose to call it home. Ben Garrett intended to give it everything he had. 3 months later, the new ranch house rose from the ashes of the old, built with the same attention to detail, but with improvements learned from bitter experience. Wider fields of fire, better positions for defenders, and walls thick enough to stop rifle bullets and Apache arrows alike. Ben stood on his new porch, watching Miguel's children play in the courtyard, where men had once fought and died. The school bell in Tombstone was ringing the close of another day, calling students home to families who lived without fear, because good men had been willing to stand against evil. Tom Bradley rode up the lane, his deputy's badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Ben, we got word from Tucson. The territorial governor wants to see you about a job offer. What kind of job? Territorial marshal. Seems your reputation has spread beyond Cochise County. Ben considered the offer as he watched the peaceful scene before him. Tell the governor I'm honored, but I've got all the job I can handle right here. Tom grinned. Figured you'd say that. But there's something else. Mexican authorities caught up with that Apache band that was helping Blackjack. Seems they had some interesting stories to tell about gold hidden in the Sierra Madre. Let someone else chase ghosts, Ben said. I'm done with treasure hunting. As Tom rode away, Ben felt the deep satisfaction of a man who'd found his place in the world and intended to keep it. The desert stretched endless and beautiful toward the horizon, promising challenges and rewards in equal measure. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the vast emptiness of Arizona territory. It was a lonesome sound, but not a lonely one. The desert was full of life for those who knew how to look for it. Ben Garrett intended to keep looking for a long time to come.